What happened at Tokyo Revengers? This went from a universally loved manga to a tragically forgotten story all because of one arc, which is a shame because this manga brought people together by honoring classic manga and resonating with all kinds of different readers. But now that it's been over 2 years, I think it's time we go back and talk about why this ending isn't as bad as you remember. So in this video, I'd like to talk about the massive popularity of Tokyo Revengers, discuss the reasons it resonated with so many different people, address the flaws that led to its tragic downfall, and explain why it's still one of the all-time best manga. Just be warned that there will be major spoilers at the end of the video. Now first I want to talk about just how popular this series was, because if you're a new fan then you might not be aware, but even if you already read the manga you might not remember just how popular it was, as it only had 2.3 million copies in circulation after 13 volumes. But around volume 22, when the anime finally dropped, the copies in circulation increased by over 2,000%, growing from 2.3 to 50 million copies in less than a year. And according to Oricon in 2023, a year after the manga ended, Tokyo Revengers sold another 3 million copies. In terms of sales, this ranks Tokyo Revengers alongside some of the all-time best manga, including Berserk, Gintama, and Yu Yu Hakusho. And of course, if you keep up with seasonal anime, then you know Tokyo Revengers was a massive success during its first season. The second and third seasons are a different story, but we'll get into that later in the video. For now, I think we can agree that Tokyo Revengers was a mainstream success. The manga didn't pick up right away, but after a while, it blew up fast, and that success paved the way for the anime to become one of the most watched anime of 2021. And you don't have to be Elon Musk to figure out why Tokyo Revengers was such a big hit. The story follows the struggles of Takemichi, a washed-up 26-year-old who has a quarter-life crisis when he finds out that his old middle school girlfriend Hinata was murdered by gangsters. But when he discovers he has the power to travel back and forth in time, he teams up with his girlfriend's brother, Naoto, to solve the mystery of Hinata's death and put an end to Tokyo's deadliest gang. To do that, he has to go back 12 years in time, infiltrate the motorcycle gang known as Tokyo Manji Gang, or Tomon for short, and find out how to stop Hinata's murderers in the past. During his mission, he becomes friends with Mikey, the laid-back leader of Tomon with a mysterious dark edge, as well as Draken, Mikey's badass right hand who's been following Mikey since they were kids. While struggling to stop Hinata's murderers, Takemichi finds a new identity in this gang of teens that solve their problems with their fists, but just want to ride motorcycles and share stories together. And with each step towards his goal, Takemichi grows into the kind of person that he was never strong enough to be in the present. Clearly, there's more than a few reasons why it's easy to get into Tokyo Revengers, and anyone that has checked it out can tell you at least one thing that they really loved. But the reason this series became so popular is because it combines so many different tropes in a way that offers an incredibly accessible story. But real quick before I say anything else, make sure to become a channel member if you're enjoying the video so far. You'll get exclusive badges and emojis to show off in our weekly live streams, and you can pick which series I cover next. Now, one thing that stands out about this manga is the time travel. I remember when I first started the anime and told my friend, and they were like, "Oh, you mean the one that's erased but better?" And you know, they weren't exactly wrong. Tokyo Revengers does run into some issues down the line, but for the most part, it's one of the better executions of a time travel story. Specifically in the way it ties the time travel into the story's big mystery and uses it to make changes to that mystery in a fun and engaging way. So right off the bat, you have a science fiction appeal as well as a mystery appeal. On top of that, one of the things that I think goes underappreciated in this story is the romance. There's more than a few romantic subplots, but the main one between Takemichi and Hinata is one of the story's biggest strong points. It takes what would otherwise be just a meat-headed thriller and gives it a welcome element of romantic tension. Now, some people will come at the show and say, "Ew, the show is weird. Why is a 26-year-old trying to date a 14 14-year-old girl. And out of context, it's definitely weird. I'm not trying to say anything like that, but obviously there's a lot more to it. First, he met her when they were the same age in middle school. He's in love with the girl in the present, not the past. Plus, he has to make things right with Hinata in the past if he wants the opportunity to start things over as an adult in the present. So in terms of the ick scale, I think we can say this series doesn't even come close to Mushoku Tensei or Seven Deadly Sins. Point being, the dynamic between Takemichi and Hinata is awesome, so it's a big reason why fans who don't want to watch just another shonen series can get into this one. And finally, probably the best thing about this story is the take on the delinquent trope. Now, in case you're unaware, the delinquent genre has been a big part of manga and has led to some of the most iconic characters and tropes in the industry. It all stems from the delinquent era of gangs in the 60s and 70s, followed by the increasing popularity of motorcycle gangs starting in the 80s and ending in the 2000s right around the time of Tomon. The whole subculture has led to tons of iconic characters like Jotaro and Josuke, Yusuke and Kurabara, and one of my favorites, Ryunosuke from Shaman King. There's a lot more manga and characters that I'm not referencing, and I'm completely doing the genre a disservice, but that's because I'm only just getting into this type of manga myself. Which brings me back to my point. This genre has always been popular with teens and younger readers, so when Tokyo Revengers came around, it took this genre, combined it with the popular trends we already discussed, and by doing so, created a new wave of delinquent manga fans. Now, I mentioned Yu Yu Hakusho before, and I want to bring it up again because it shares one big thing in common with Tokyo Revengers, namely the delinquent background. Yu Yu Hakusho is not a delinquent manga, but the reason so many young fans resonated with it back in the day was because they shared that common background. Like Yusuke, a lot of people had a less than normal home life and got into trouble at school. And this is exactly what happened again with Tokyo Revengers. Maybe you didn't grow up in the hood, so to speak, but regardless of where or how you grew up, everyone knew a Mikey. Everyone knew a Draken. Everyone at one point in their life has had that one group of troublemaking friends. And on top of all of that, everyone has had the one that got away. So Tokyo Revengers is kind of funny because it is literally a story about nostalgia because of the time travel. It's a story of nostalgia because it looks back on the era of motorcycle gangs in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it's a story of nostalgia that anyone can relate to because it brings up memories of shared upbringings and rough times. Clearly, the reason Tokyo Revengers is such a popular story is because it's the kind of story that anyone can get into. Even if you don't love every element like the motorcycles or the romance, there's something for everyone to invest in. That's why it was such a mainstream success. But of course, I'm using the past tense here, partly because the manga is finished, but also because it's not exactly a mainstream success anymore. And this wasn't something that happened overnight, but it almost happened even faster than the story's burst of popularity. I did a video almost 2 years ago titled Why Bad Manga Can Ruin Good Anime. At the time, I was still anime only, but as an anime and manga YouTuber, I was very aware of the manga's final reception. I managed to avoid any spoilers, but the general impression was that the series creator Ken Wakui had ruined what was an otherwise perfectly good manga. So I made this video right after season 3 ended because I was loving the new seasons, but whereas the entire community was hyping up season 1, it was complete radio silence by the time season 3 dropped. I mean, like, nobody was talking about the anime. Now, there are a couple of other reasons for this. Naturally, because the manga was finished, you had less interest than before. Another big factor was Disney was acquiring the streaming rights to a bunch of KODANSHA anime, which led to a very awkward transition where you had to watch season 1 on Crunchyroll and then seasons 2 and 3 on Hulu if you were in the States. Hulu isn't exactly an anime killer, but its track record so far is less than amazing. But of course, the big reason nobody was talking about the anime was because everyone was sick of the manga. Now again, I only just read the manga. Back then, all I knew was that everyone thought the manga should have ended before the last arc, and that last arc ruined what was basically a perfect story. In other words, the story was complete, but everyone hated the ending because it felt redundant and in some cases actually ruined the earlier parts of the story. Again, I'm coming into this late, so I can't speak to those initial impressions, but as someone who's been watching the anime since day one and still loves the manga, it's only fair that we have an honest discussion about the story's clear flaws. First of all, and this goes back to chapter 1, but one of the things a lot of people would use to attack the story is that it was corny. Stuff like Takemichi is a crybaby, it uses the power of friendship, the usual stuff. Now, I can't argue with that. A lot of that stuff is true to an extent, so if you don't like stories that lean into a lot of corny tropes, then that's understandable. But it's also important to remember that this is a story that relies heavily on nostalgia. Naturally, it's going to be a wholesome story that ultimately ends things on a positive note. So saying that Tokyo Revengers is corny is ignoring the underlying appeal of the story. That being said, this does influence a lot of the events in the ending that I can't exactly defend. And let's talk about what I mean. So the big arc before the final arc is the Tenjiku arc. The series antagonist teams up with Mikey's lost brother Izana in a final attempt to take over Tomon. In a dastardly scheme, Kisaki leaves Mikey and Draken both unable to fight, leaving Takemichi as the acting leader of the gang against some of Tokyo's strongest delinquents. By all definitions, his team clearly should have lost, but through an unwavering brotherhood and sheer willpower, Takemichi's group stands up to the enemy gang, Mikey comes to terms with his family, and Takemichi finally defeats Kisaki and saves Hinata. So he gets Mikey to disband Tomon, everyone gets their dream ending in the future, and Takemichi gets engaged to his dream girl. By all means, this was the perfect ending. He made some hard choices and lost some friends along the way, but Takemichi overcame those obstacles and earned the perfect ending that he deserved. Except this wasn't the ending, because while everyone else is in La La Land, Takemichi soon learns that Mikey is leading a new gang due to the mysterious dark impulse that's been controlling him his entire life. So Takemichi goes back in time and has to create a new gang and get into another big fight. Now, there's a million things people don't like, but again, I wasn't around and I don't want to misrepresent anyone. If you'd like to see what people were saying, you can find the reviews pretty easy. That being said, there's at least a couple of blatant flaws. First of all is the so-called dark impulse, specifically the way it tied into the series finale. Prior to this ending, Wakui had done a great job of explaining the time travel and keeping everything consistent as he developed the story and added new layers. And the whole time, it was repeatedly established that Mikey had a dark side to him that practically haunted him. But then in the final arc, this dark impulse gets a name and gains an almost occult element, which isn't that absurd in a time travel story. But what's worse is we find out that Mikey's older brother was the original time leaper, that he saved Mikey and gave him the curse of the dark impulse as a result, and he was the one that gave Takemichi his powers. There's also some other factors like the fact that Takemichi gains the power to see into the future, and the fact that the new villain Haruchio was kind of implied to be the second time leaper in order to create a red herring. All in all, Wakui aims to answer all of our questions about the time travel and resolve Mikey's arc, and he does achieve this, but in a way that feels somewhat overcomplicated considering how the Tenjiku arc was handled. Speaking of which, another big problem with this ending is how repetitive it feels. For example, Tenjiku is a battle between Tokyo's two biggest gangs, and the enemy gang has this group of super tough fighters that all went to juvie together, but they're eventually defeated. But in the final arc, these characters all come back, plus you get some new characters that are basically like the super version of those guys. You also have this character Kakucho, who was a big part of Tenjiku and got a resolution, who was then wedged in with the villains again with no new character growth. On top of that, the fight takes place in basically the same place. Prior to this, Wakui was always good about making the setting a big part of the fights. So like in one arc, the fight's outside of a festival. In another arc, they fight in some big junkyard. In one arc where the fight happens on Christmas, they actually fight in a church. In Tenjiku, it just happens in some random shipyard. but Takemichi chases Kisaki down to the spot where Hinata gets murdered in the future. But in the final fight, it just happens in some random spot that looks and feels like the shipyard in Tenjiku. It's another big fight in another random spot, so I couldn't help reading the final fight and being like, am I crazy, or is this just Tenjiku all over again? On top of everything feeling so repetitive, you also have new twists that don't quite hit. For example, Senju is introduced as this important character but ultimately ends up as one of the more forgettable characters. Then Draken dies saving Takemichi, which would have been pretty good, except he gets saved in the ending. Without getting into too much detail, the characters go back in time one last time, and when they do, they save everyone. This includes Draken, Ouji, who was dead for a really long time and influenced a ton of characters, and Kisaki. Yes, the villain who ordered the assassination of civilians and runs all the drugs and prostitution in Tokyo, and ruins Takemichi's life, is ultimately saved. So among other things, people didn't like this ending because it overcomplicated things, it reused a lot of the same stuff from the previous arc, and it undid all of the major deaths and forcefully redeemed the true villain of the story. Now, here's what I have to say about these flaws. First, let me just say that I hate what happens to Kisaki. He was the perfect scumbag and had the perfect death, so I think the fact that he's saved in the end just because Takemichi and Mikey respect him is stupid. Like, I can see why they feel bad for him, but just because Wakui wanted to establish some sympathy for the villain doesn't mean he had to give him a half-assed redemption. So to that point, I think it's a pretty clear flaw in the story. In regard to the repetitiveness, I don't think it's as bad as the Kisaki thing, but to a lesser extent, I also think it's a pretty clear flaw for the simple reason that the final arc just feels like a rehashing of all of the same tropes and formulas we had already seen. Now, in regard to the ending complicating and arguably ruining the story, that's where I have to disagree. Do I think the ending is flawed? Yes. Do I think that Wakui kind of shoehorned these final resolutions into the ending in a way that is clearly less polished than the other 200 chapters? Yes. But do I think these things ruined the entire story? Not even close. I could spend another 20 minutes listing everything wrong about the ending, but there's plenty of other videos that already do that, and I've kinda addressed the main issues. Plus, I don't think this ending is as objectively bad as people think it is. I think we needed another arc to resolve this dark edge to Mikey's character. Did I like the way it was handled? Not really. But I did like the irony that the curse that made Mikey this way was caused by the brother he practically worshipped. I liked that Wakui gave some context to the time leaping as a morally gray tool that could only be used for good depending on the user. I also liked that Wakui set things up so that Takemichi was basically carrying the will of Mikey's brother the whole time, so the final fight was like the last goodbye Mikey never got to have. There's a lot of other things I enjoyed, like the fact that Taiju was redeemed in the end, and the way Takemichi brought the original Tomon back together. Again, it did feel somewhat repetitive, but I also really enjoyed Takemichi developing the next generation along with Chifuyu and Hawkeye. It's a small thing, but it went a long way to show how Takemichi had grown as a leader by building his own crew like Mikey had done before. At the end of the day, it's not the best ending in the world. And especially considering how emotionally invested people were, it makes total sense why it got the reception it did. But at the same time, it's hard to look back and say that this ending completely undermines the influence this story had on fans. It created a new generation of delinquent manga fans, but more than anything, it was a massive source of nostalgia that resonated with people who grew up with tough times and tougher friends. It's a heavy story that still ends things on a positive note. While it doesn't exactly stick the landing, it's impossible to say the rest of the story isn't a thing of beauty. So sure, the ending does hurt the overall impression, but it does have its upsides. Plus, no matter what anyone says, Tokyo Revengers will always be one of my all-time favorite stories. But what do you think? How did you like the ending? Do you think it ruins the story? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And don't forget to become a channel member. You'll get exclusive badges and emojis. You can pick which series I cover next, and you can get credited in future videos. Also check out my original video, which you can find in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.